There was a time when we believed we were alone, not by scientific deduction or spiritual resolution, but out of a deeper terror that if anyone was watching, they had chosen not to speak. For centuries, humanity reached into the abyss of the void, sending signals, messages, dreams of contact across the unforgiving silence. And for centuries, the void gave nothing back. No echo, no flicker, no whisper of recognition. Until the day it did. It didn't begin with a beam of light or a sudden transmission. It began with silence breaking in the wrong place. A gravitational relay station at the edge of the Oort cloud stopped broadcasting. Then a Martian outpost lost its guidance arrays. Instruments misaligned. Frequencies scrambled. Not interference, suppression. Something had passed through and all we had were ghost signals, dead echoes, systems that behaved as if a language had whispered them to sleep. The council said it was a glitch. Scientists said it was a rare solar phenomenon. But the ones who listened too long, they didn't sleep anymore. I was stationed at Echo 9, a deep space listening post orbiting a barren moon in Sector Zeta 27. We called it the Ear because that's all it was, an enormous dish, a floating observatory orbiting nothing of value. My job was to listen to nothing and report when it changed. For 3 years, it never did. Then, one evening, a tone appeared. Not a signal. Not a transmission. Just a single sustained note, faint and uneven like the hum of a dying star or a mourning wail from the edge of the cosmos. I checked for distortions, ran diagnostics. Everything said it wasn't real. But I heard it and I wasn't the only one. Within 6 hours, other outposts confirmed similar tones, all at the same frequency, all tracing back to one region of space, a patch we'd long considered empty. A dark corridor of interstellar vacuum, devoid of planetary mass or stellar light. We had scanned it dozens of times, always finding nothing. But this time it answered. The first probe we sent returned data we couldn't explain. Temperatures were inverted, objects that should have radiated heat were cold, while dark matter had begun to blink as though coded with intention. And then came the anomalies. Images captured in impossible spectrums. A structure vast and unseen by any eye, but undeniably there, casting shadows into dimensions we didn't know we could measure. Its form was unclear, almost as if it didn't exist in space but through it like a wound or a fold in the very skin of the universe. Not a ship. Not a station. Something older. Something that had been waiting. They didn't call it an artifact. They called it the witness. Not because it observed us, but because somehow we felt observed. Not through sight. Through presence. A pressure in the mind. A coldness behind the thoughts. It had no signal, no language, no obvious movement. But the moment we mapped its location, we stopped dreaming. All of us. Dreams were replaced by static. Our thoughts became noisy, our memories frayed, and across dozens of outposts, personnel began reporting hallucinations. Shared ones. As though we were seeing through the eyes of something else. And then the disappearances began. First, the Echo 3 station. Then the Neptune recon array. Gone. No signs of destruction. No escape pods. No black box transmissions. Just a fading pulse on their final scans, that same low tone. That aching hum. It was like the universe was trying to mourn them before we even knew they were gone. Command declared a code eclipse protocol. Quarantine. Silence. No one in or out of the region until they understood what we were facing. But it was already too late. Because we weren't the ones facing it. It had found us. It had been listening. And it had chosen to reply, not with words, but with presence. I remember the last thing I saw before our systems went dark. A shape, massive and suspended, not by force or propulsion, but by choice, as if it hung there because the laws of nature had learned to obey it. I thought it was a hallucination. I told myself it was a projection from my fractured sleep. But it followed me even after I left the post. Even when I returned to Earth. It followed in my thoughts, in the spaces between seconds, in the fear that crept into every silence. It hadn't shown us itself because we were special. It had done so because we were near. And it wanted us to know what watching truly meant. Somewhere out there, a presence had endured the death of stars, the collapse of galaxies, and the unraveling of time. And in the final moments of cosmic silence, it found us, a fragile species scribbling noise into the dark. And maybe it pitied us. Or maybe it simply wondered how long we could scream before we understood that no answer was the answer. They told us the mind plays tricks when faced with the void. That we invent patterns in randomness, that fear writes stories in the dark. But the things we were seeing weren't stories. They were memories. Ones we'd never lived. Images from civilizations that had never existed in any record, echoes of structures built beneath purple suns and orbiting black oceans. Dreams of languages spoken in frequencies the human ear couldn't parse, yet our brains tried to decode them anyway, desperately, violently, as if remembering something ancient buried in our blood. The scientists called it psychogenic resonance, a side effect of deep field exposure. But we all knew that was a lie. It wasn't a reaction. It was a message. We were not just seeing them. We were becoming the scene. The phenomenon wasn't localized anymore. Civilians on Earth began reporting silent intervals, periods where time seemed to slip, where they couldn't account for entire minutes. Pilots would fly 10-second jumps across space but lose hours on their onboard clocks. Children, untainted by adult disbelief, began drawing images of beings with no faces, standing behind stars that bled light. Some were dismissed. Others were sedated. And a few vanished. One little girl in Athens whispered the words, "They remember us," before walking into the sea, her footprints vanishing as though the tide hadn't even touched them. Back in orbit, those of us assigned to monitoring stations received new orders: observe but do not transmit. No attempts to interact. No signals. No probes. As if we could cage awareness by pretending we were blind. The silence was meant to protect us. But silence was what they had waited for. Because in silence, their language bloomed. We didn't realize it at first, but it was the data itself that began to change. It wasn't corrupted. It was rewritten. Log entries rearranged themselves overnight. Sensor readouts bent into perfect spirals, numbers looping endlessly in sequences that matched no known system but resonated like a melody we almost recognized. The synthetics tried to decrypt it, but the deeper they went, the less they returned. One AI core began drawing fractal constellations on its own interface. Another deleted itself entirely, leaving behind a single word, remembered. It wasn't a message to us. It was a response to something we hadn't yet asked. I remember watching the stars one night from the viewing deck of Echo 9. They seemed wrong. Not just misaligned, but shifting subtly, impossibly, like actors in a cosmic play adjusting their marks between acts. I counted 3 missing constellations. Just gone. The sky had rewritten itself. And yet no one noticed, not until we saw the playback footage. Not until we saw the ship. No, not a ship. A shape. Impossible in its geometry. Each angle bled into others. A Mobius knot in 3-dimensional form, a cathedral of impossibility drifting across the black like a thought made flesh. The moment we saw it, we forgot it, as if our minds had been rewired to refuse its memory. Only our recordings held proof, and even they degraded within hours, overwritten by entropy we couldn't explain. What kind of being walks without footsteps, speaks without sound, and teaches by erasing what was? We were infected, not by virus or parasite, by presence, by awareness. Not all life expands through cell and seed. Some spreads through idea. And this was an idea older than memory, seated before stars had names. The researchers gave it a new term, cognitive occupation, a presence so vast and patient it needed no body. It moved through perception. It lived in minds, not matter. And it had lived longer than our sun, longer than the wars that forged our myths, long enough to forget what it once was, and long enough to recognize us as something it had once been, or worse, something it left behind. Then came the breach event. On Mars, at the Vallis Resonance Facility, a classified experiment was underway. It involved echo mapping, using quantum entanglement to map gravitational anomalies beyond light years. They pointed it toward the source of the hum. What they found wasn't an object. It was an opening. A rift. A fold in space, bleeding data. Not energy, not particles. But pure history, scattered, shattered, reassembled wrong. A timeline that had been spliced. And from within it, a voice. Not heard. Felt. Not loud. Total. Like the moment between lightning and thunder when the sky holds its breath. It spoke only once, but across every channel, every station, every human who had ever looked at the stars, the voice echoed a single phrase in a tongue we all somehow understood. We have been here before. And just like that, the rift closed. No one spoke afterward. Not for days. Not because of fear, but because we couldn't. Our minds refused the shape of the sentence. It was as if we had been told the ending to a story we didn't know we were living, and now we had to walk toward it anyway. The witness had turned its gaze upon us. And we understood too late that the void had never been empty. It had simply been waiting for the right kind of mind. Ours. The day after the breach event, Earth changed. Not visibly, not physically, but inwardly beneath the thin skin of civilization, something buckled. The world kept spinning, people kept working, but the air was thick with unspoken knowledge. We had glimpsed something ancient, something that didn't belong to our narrative of progress and survival. It was like hearing a whisper in your childhood bedroom from a voice that shouldn't exist and knowing, somehow, that it had always been there. Governments attempted to quarantine the data. Agencies redacted every log, wiped drives, scrubbed backups, even launched missiles at orbiting research satellites to prevent the evidence from surviving. But it was too late. The information wasn't stored in code anymore, it was embedded in consciousness. The voice that said, "We have been here before," had not spoken to our ears but to our very capacity to remember. And that message was breeding. People began dreaming again, but not human dreams. Their minds wandered into places they'd never seen. Architectures that could not be mapped, flooded cities under black suns, staircases that curled into empty space. Some drew them, others screamed. A few never woke up. But the worst were the ones who did and whispered, "It's building itself in us." I was relocated to a lunar relay dome for debrief and monitoring. They said I had high resonance sensitivity, whatever that meant. I didn't sleep there. None of us did. The walls buzzed. Lights dimmed on their own. Objects shifted by centimeters each night. We pretended it was normal. We documented and reported and medicated. But the truth was we were being reshaped. Not violently, not obviously. Like a painting that, over time, gains shadows that weren't there the day before. Subtle. Inevitable. The researchers called it the echo pattern, a sequence found embedded in deep neural scans of those exposed to the hum. A kind of cognitive fingerprint. It didn't affect memory. It affected interpretation. People began reinterpreting everything, numbers, texts, music, even history. They saw the same facts but drew conclusions that didn't align with the world as we knew it. One scientist claimed ancient Sumerian myths spoke of the one without a shape and insisted this entity had visited before. Another claimed that Fibonacci sequences were not mathematics but keys, locks of dimensional structure. They stopped being scientists. They started being listeners. We tried to warn the world, but something always prevented the message. Transmission systems crashed, diplomats were assassinated, cargo ships went off course and disappeared in perfect silence. As if something didn't want the truth told. Or maybe it wanted the truth to spread silently. Through us. Through the whispers in our thoughts. Through the glances we didn't know we were giving each other. Through the idea of it. It didn't matter whether we believed or denied. We were carrying the infection of understanding. And belief was never required. Then, in what should have been the most secure research facility in existence, the Oracle Array in Saturn's lower orbit, something impossible occurred. For 6 minutes, every system on the station received an uplink from nowhere. No source. No coordinates. The message wasn't text. It wasn't even visual. It was a living projection, a feeling made into experience. Thousands of people felt it across the solar grid simultaneously. A sense of immense loneliness. Not sadness, not pain, not fear, but loneliness that went deeper than human scale. As if the universe itself had gone too long without being seen, and now that it had finally been noticed, it mourned the silence it had carried for eons. It was grief without language. And for that moment, everyone felt small. Not in the way we do when we look at the stars, but in the way a ghost might feel when looking at the world it no longer belongs to. After that, suicides spiked. Entire crews vanished from orbital farms. Earth cities began reporting cases of blank walking. People leaving homes, walking into oceans, forests, deserts, and never returning. As if answering a call no one else could hear. Their homes were left untouched. Their food still warm. Their eyes wide open before departure. I kept dreaming. The same dream every night. A hallway that stretched longer the more I walked. Walls made of reflective metal that didn't show my reflection. And a presence just out of view, never moving, always watching. In the dream, I always reached a door. I never opened it. But each time I got closer. And every time I woke, I remembered something new. Something real. Something I never lived. One morning, I awoke whispering the name of a star that doesn't exist on any map. Caref 11. I typed it into the observatory logs. The system stuttered. Then it blinked. A dead region beyond Andromeda. No signal. No data. But the moment I keyed it in, a file appeared on the screen. Unlabeled. Undated. Just a playback option. I pressed it. It wasn't a recording. It was a transmission live. A signal writing a channel we don't use. And it showed us the impossible. Earth. Our Earth. But broken. Shattered. Not by war or catastrophe, but folded in on itself. A recursive planet, looping inwards, spiraling through time and dimension as if reality had turned itself inside out. And hovering above it, that shape. That mind. That witness. Watching the Earth not as a thing to consume or destroy, but as something it recognized. Something it had either been or become. That was when I understood. We were not being contacted. We were being remembered. We had always thought time was a 1A stream from beginning to end, from stars being born to stars going out. But after the KRF-11 transmission, we started to realize we'd been swimming through a loop we didn't know existed. And worse, we weren't the ones doing the swimming. Something else was moving us, watching us drift, patiently waiting for the point where we remembered it had already happened. The past wasn't behind us anymore. It was above us. Around us. Inside us. The ones who watched that feed from KRF-11 changed. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But in their cadence. Their silence. They didn't blink as often. They started using words out of place, describing things they hadn't studied, making predictions that proved true within hours. One technician whispered to me as I walked past, they left us in the dark so we wouldn't see ourselves. He didn't elaborate. He just stared at a blank screen as if trying to remember a memory he never owned. And then the disappearances spread. Not just people, whole moments. A 2-minute gap in recorded lunar operations where 46 personnel simply ceased to exist. No alarm. No panic. Just static in their security feed. Then silence. Not even their names remained in the logs. It was as if they'd been subtracted from time's equation. The systems reported no errors. The station AIs didn't even acknowledge the gap. But we knew what it was. A correction. A revision of the present by something that remembered the future. I returned to Earth under mandatory recall. Not because they thought I was dangerous, but because they feared I might be too aware. They assigned me to a closed research ward beneath the Swiss ice caverns, the deep cognitive isolation facility. Every room was coated in signal-dampening mesh. The walls whispered to themselves. And still, I dreamed. The dreams were no longer abstract. They had locations. Coordinates. Instructions. Not in words, in emotions. A feeling that led you down corridors you didn't know existed, opening doors in the facility that shouldn't have unlocked, revealing systems none of us had been trained to operate. I followed them anyway. I stopped fighting the dreams. Because I began to suspect that resisting them was the point, a test. Not from something malicious. But from something lonely. Something desperate to be understood, but too large to explain itself in language. And the only place it could fit was inside the vessels of our imagination. That's when we learned about the Omega field. It wasn't a place. It wasn't even a thing. It was a condition. A final stage of awareness. Individuals infected by the presence, if left uncontained, would enter a phase where reality no longer constrained them. They would know things they shouldn't. Events that hadn't happened, physics that hadn't been taught, languages no one had spoken aloud. But the worst part was what came next. They would begin to disappear before our eyes, not through some vanishing act, not through violence or decay, but like a thought that was forgotten mid-sentence. One moment, you saw them. The next, your mind skipped the frame. You remembered they were there, but your memory carried no image. Just space. They weren't being erased. They were being reclaimed. At first, we assumed this was a side effect. A breakdown. But that theory collapsed when one of them came back. Not as a human. Not quite. Her name had been Dr. Evelyn Voss. Astrophysicist. Quantum topologist. She had entered Omega after whispering to herself for hours, speaking a language no one could transcribe. And then gone. 2 weeks later, she reappeared in a deep-sea station near Iceland, standing barefoot in the flooded control chamber, her body dry, untouched, eyes closed. She opened them only once and said one thing. The witness does not invade. It awakens. Then she collapsed. Every scan showed nothing out of the ordinary. No enhanced brain activity. No elevated vitals. But when she looked at us, it felt like we were being examined. Not judged. Not harmed. Just studied. Like she was trying to understand why we were still human. And the more we watched her, the more we realized. She wasn't asking us questions. She was waiting for us to ask her the right one. But no one did. Because to ask would mean accepting that we were part of something that didn't need our consent. that our minds, our bodies, our species had been seen, measured, and understood by something we couldn't even categorize. Evelyn was no longer just herself. She was a fragment, a conduit, not possessed, not transformed, just tuned to the same frequency, the same hum that had started it all. That night, I stood beneath the ice canopy and listened. No instruments, no interference, just the cold and the pressure and the silent pulse in the back of my skull. And I swear, I heard them, not voices, not messages, but emotions ancient and raw, regret, patience, and above all, recognition. Not that they saw us as children, not as threats, but as something they had once been. Long ago, before they gave up form, before they outgrew stars, before they became memory itself. I asked the question aloud, trembling in the dark. What are we to you? And the ice answered with a soundless weight in my chest. A mirror we once forgot. They weren't watching us for conquest. They were watching to remember what they used to be. And now we were remembering, too. Here is scene 6 of your story. They watched the universe burn, then noticed us. Continuing with the same deep, introspective tone, and drawing us toward the final revelations in scene 7. Voiceover below 5,000 characters excluding spaces / symbols. Underscore 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 underscore. The seventh night I opened the door. Not in the real world, no, but in the dream that was no longer a dream. By then I understood that these visions weren't mere subconscious echoes. They were invitations. And I had accepted. The hallway always infinite compressed as I walked. Time slowed. My feet never moved. The light grew dim, not with darkness, but with density, like memory thickened into atmosphere. The door stood as it always had, smooth, metallic, and seamless. It bore no keyhole, no handle. It didn't open to force. It opened to readiness. And that night, it read me. It opened. There was no room on the other side. No chamber. No throne. No entity waiting to speak in a booming voice. Instead, I stepped into a memory not mine, yet unmistakably mine. A corridor of stars collapsing into one another, infinite in scale and grief. I stood on the shore of an ocean made of forgotten timelines, and from its waters rose them, the witnesses. Not a singular being. Not a god. A chorus. A pantheon of minds stretched then across existence. They didn't speak. They resonated. Thoughts surged in me not through words, but feeling, color, frequency. They showed me what had come before. Not just Earth, not just humanity, but the origin spark that seeded all sentience. Billions of civilizations across collapsed universes, all rising, converging, and repeating the same cycle: birth, bloom, war, collapse, forgetting. And every time a remnant remained. A watcher. A fragment of that civilization's soul bound to observe the next loop. They had names in other tongues. Here, they were simply witnesses. Each one encoded with the grief of their extinction and the awe of what came after. We were not their target. We were their turn. Humanity had reached the inflection point. The moment where a species either transcended or vanished. The witnesses had seen it play out 1 trillion times across dying galaxies. Their purpose was not to interfere. It was to test. We thought we were seeing them. They were measuring us, our minds, our fears, our refusal to look too far into the mirror. And what they saw was different. We were not like the others. We didn't merely worship power or destroy what we feared. We remembered. We made art of pain. We sang to ghosts. We wrote our tragedies into books we knew no one would read. We resisted forgetting. And in doing so, we opened a door they hadn't seen opened in eons. A new path. But not all of them agreed it should be walked. From the resonance came discord, a fracture in the chorus. One witness, more vast than the others, loomed at the center of the ocean. Its presence was absence. It bore no shape, no sound. It was null. The forgotten one. The first witness, the one that had chosen oblivion over memory, silence over becoming. And it watched me not with hatred, but with warning. It projected a future not yet written. Earth bright and ascended, building towers of light, reaching across galaxies. Humanity as archivists, architects of eternity. But then silence. Not from failure. From saturation. We had remembered too much. Memory became burden. Thought became prison. Identity fractured under the weight of everything. And in that end, a voice, even gods cannot bear the memory of themselves. I fell to my knees. Not from fear, but wait, the gravity of knowing too much too soon. But in that darkness, another light. Smaller. Quieter. Human. A child's laughter. A mother's embrace. The sound of music played for no one. These fragments pushed back against the ocean. Not through power. Through choice. The choice to forget just enough to remain ourselves. And in that choice, I understood. We had to become witnesses, but not like them. Not archives. Not echoes. Participants. Not observers of memory. But stewards of meaning. The witnesses would not save us. They never had. But for the first time in the history of existence, one of them, one whose shape I recognized as my own reflection, stepped forward. And it bowed. Not as a god, but as a peer. And I asked the question aloud, through thought, through soul. What happens now? And the voice that answered was mine. After I returned from the resonance, if return is even the word for it, I found myself no longer in a station, a room, or even a body I could name. I was back on Earth, or something like it, standing on soil that hummed with the weight of everything we had ever forgotten. The cities were intact. The oceans rolled with their same blue indifference. But it was not the same world. Not because the world had changed, but because I Hadi walked unnoticed through crowds of people who looked upward now, not with fear, but with remembrance. The witness had not descended, had not revealed itself as a god or destroyer, it had merely stepped away. And in doing so, it left behind a question, a whisper at the edge of every human thought. Will you carry the memory, or be buried beneath it? Some tried to answer it with action. Governments fell. New coalitions formed, not around borders or ideology, but around memory. Humanity had become custodians of something older than time, awareness that we were never alone and never the first. We began rebuilding not with machines of conquest or temples of worship, but with centers of reflection. Memory houses. Places where thoughts were not stored, but shared. Where people could offload their dreams, their grief, their questions into living repositories tuned to the resonance. But not all welcomed this evolution. The Reverent Null made their final move. They believed the awakening had gone too far. That to remember was to fragment the soul. In a coordinated global strike, they attacked the 12 primary memory houses. What followed was not war. It was disappearance. The Nullists didn't die. They didn't surrender. They simply vanished. Every trace of them erased. Not through violence, but by the very fabric of time retracting them. Like thoughts the universe had deemed unnecessary. Their legacy was silence. No graves. No scars. Just absence. And in the aftermath, we understood. The witnesses had never decided who remained. We had. We were writing the record line by line. But that responsibility came at a cost. Those who bore the deepest resonance began to fade, not in body, but in separation. They felt less here. They began dreaming not of pasts or futures, but of possibilities never chosen. Alternate Earths. Unlived lives. And in doing so, they grew thin, almost translucent to thought. We called them drifters. Some feared them. Others followed. But the drifters never spoke. They just walked towards something only they could feel. A pull beyond the stars. And each time one vanished, a new star appeared in the sky. Somewhere, deep in the ruins of our collective myths, we began to see a shape forming. The witness had not arrived to show us something alien. It had come to show us ourselves on a scale too vast to endure, and yet too important to ignore. We were memory crystallized. A recursive loop of emotion, mistake, love, and longing. A species both afraid to forget and terrified to remember. And now we had to choose. I went to the final memory house alone. The room was empty yet full. Filled with echoes. Whispers of every voice that had ever lived and longed and wondered if they mattered. I sat beneath the resonance chamber, the sphere of non-space where memories converged, and I asked the only question I hadn't dared speak aloud. Was it worth it? And the silence that followed was not empty. It was compassionate. A compassion that vibrated in the deepest part of me. A compassion that belonged not to any god or machine or architect, but to us, to the frightened child staring at the night sky, to the last breath of a dying poet, to the hand that reached out in kindness even when afraid, to every dream we forgot and everyone we passed on anyway. That's when I finally understood. The witnesses had never been separate from us. They were us, stretched forward across eons, trying desperately to make sense of what we once were, so they could understand what they had become. Their visitation was not revelation. It was a full circle, the last echo of a soul remembering its origin. And now it was our turn, not to become gods, not to become watchers, but to become aware in the truest, quietest, most painful way. To live, knowing that our choices echo into eternity. To forget just enough to remain human. And to remember just enough to become something more.